Well, there we are. I think it's a really strange thing to talk about my life, because by putting me here like this, you make it my life, as if I was an individual. While of course lives are always connections with other people, and with all kind of situations. So we're here in a sort of bizarre, cut off, isolated, one-on-one thing. But that's what we do. So I'll try to make something of it, and from time to time mention some of the many people who were part of the path so far. I grew up in Limburg, very much in the south of the Netherlands, and from my bedroom I could see 5 coal mines, and in a way Limburg was not really part of the Netherlands. It was in that it supplied the Netherlands with coal and money, but it wasn't culturally. And my parents weren't even from Limburg. So if you saw the television in the Netherlands, there was nobody ever with an accent from Limburg. And people who were from there first were taught to not speak with that accent. My parents were not from Limburg, they were from Brabant, which is also the Catholic South. But in Limburg, because the Netherlands is split in the Catholic South and a Protestant North, or it was. It's now fairly secularized, if not really. Anyway, my parents were not from there. They were import, as it was called, so I never belonged. So I started as a proper anthropologist, never quite belonging. Good. I went to school, to the Holy Heart of Mary School, went between 6 and 12, and then I went on to what was called the Corriovallum College. So this was in Heerlen, the adjacent town, which had been called Corriovallum in the Roman period, and it was a former girls' school, and my year was the first year where we also had boys. We are now talking 1970. It was sort of quite fun to have the boys and still have the girls sort of in power. So anyway, that was good like that. But I really, maybe just in retrospect, thought that the nuns were really interesting role models for an intellectual woman, because they were intellectually strong, they were spiritually strong, they were independent. Well, they only depended on each other. They were fascinating. But that secondary school was really also good for me in other ways, because the teachers really encouraged us to do cultural stuff. There was a photo course, a theater course, we had the school newspaper, the lots. So I amused myself, but I also was bored. So what I did in class is I kept a notebook. I made notes. And yeah, at the end of my 6th year, I wrote a book about school. So that's my first ethnography. No. It was between literature and ethnography, and I knew that. It was a sort of weird book. Of course, I never did anything with it, but I still have it. Well, not of course, but I did never. And then I went to study in Utrecht, which is in the middle of the country. And my idea was to get to know what a human is. My father, who was a medical doctor, had convinced me that then it would be a good idea to start on the natural science side of it. Good, that sounded very plausible. In secondary school also there is the same idea that reality is really what the natural sciences make of it. So I enrolled as a student of medicine, but in my first year I was deeply disillusioned. Because I had the feeling they were stopping my ability to think, that I was actually undermined. There were lots of facts, it was interesting, fair enough, but good gracious, there was no reflection. So then I was looking around, and somebody sent me to a friend of a friend, and who was a philosophy student, and that actually had been something I had been considering before to study, because we had a priest in secondary school who was a bit, as priests were at the time, disenchanted by teaching the Bible, so he had taught us philosophy. He had told us existential phenomenology. I thought that was fascinating. Good. So anyway, in my second year, I also enrolled as a student of philosophy. And I kept doing medicine with the help of lots of friends who gave me their notes so that I could lead two lives at the same time. And I led two lives at the same time, but I was also taking refuge from one into the other. Both were very interesting, but I thought both were alienating. In medical school, in my mind, there was not enough reflection. In philosophy, there was lots of reflection, but there was somehow no sense of tragedy. It was too rationalist. Not all courses, but in a way, there was not so much connection with what was going on here now in the world, with this and that happening. Okay, I did this after 3 years. I had what was then a bachelor's in both things, and then in medical school the idea was to go on in clinical studies. But I thought if I do that and have to reflect on it, I'm going to go nuts. So I went into a sort of escape master's where I made my own program. And I had a professor of general practice who supervised me, and I read history, sociology, geography, anthropology, the lots, as long as it was about medicine. So I became a sort of amateur social scientist. And I also did fieldwork. Nobody had told me to do fieldwork, but I read fieldwork of other people, and I absorbed that. And since it was a skill I had developed earlier, I sort of pulled it off at the level that I could at the time. But it was also, I did fieldwork in general practices and also in pediatrics in the children's hospital. And my hope there had been to study the coexistence of the different specialties within pediatrics, the different ways of knowing and practicing together. But I couldn't pull that off. That was just too difficult. I tried, but I failed. But I failed gloriously. I wrote a thesis, but not what I had hoped. At the same time, I also did the master's in philosophy. And there I wrote a thesis together with Peter van Lieshout, with whom I did a lot of assignments together. And we wrote, and it sounds a bit funny now, because this was 1981, we're now. We wrote a thesis about the philosophical consequences of the turn to science, to social studies of science, to sociology. So people now think that that is more or less when STS started, but we tried to articulate what we thought were the philosophical consequences. And we put that as that the consequences were that science was no longer to be seen as something representing the world, but as part of the world and as a conglomerate of words, things, tools and other things, and activities. And that was a bit a weird type of thesis, because the idea in philosophy was that you would write a thesis about this or that chapter of Kant, or compare two books by Diderot or something like that, or maybe to do something more recent, but then the comment on Habermas. But what we did is a bit, well, audacious, sort of. We wanted to redefine the world, and this was very much spurred by the students' movement of the time, where we all had the idea, not all, but where many of us had the idea that well, it was all fine what we were taught, but come on, this was a new era. We were going to do things differently. Good. So I had then, in 1982, I had these two masters and got a grant to study in Paris. And that was smashing, because I skipped something that I wanted to tell you, because I thought I knew France. Because as an adolescent in school, I had been there. I had been to colonies de vacances, holiday camps in France, because that was a way that my parents gave me a good holiday without having to go with me. And that also I learned French, And that was actually also rather formative for becoming an anthropologist, in that in the Netherlands I was this very verbal person who was good in Dutch, or was really verbal, but who was really bad in sports because I couldn't catch a ball. Well, in France, I was really badly verbal. I had problem expressing myself, but we were there in the camp. We could do kayaking and we could sail, and I loved that. So suddenly I was not verbal, but a sports person, and I realized that, and I thought, this is so interesting. So the whole idea that you have an identity that is not given with you, but that is dependent on where you are and it is situational. Well, I didn't need constructivist theory for that. It was given to me with life. So after that, I thought, well, I know about France, but the colonie de vacances was in the Creuse, which is a fairly poor department on 2/3 south, and it was not Paris. I really had a culture shock in Paris, and nobody had aggressed me so much in my life before that than just the person in the post office. I would really get scared, and I also had an intellectual culture shock because we had been reading Canguilhem, Foucault, and we thought we understood where this came from. But for instance, in one of the assignments I had written, I had used Canguilhem to attack rationalism in the Anglo-Saxon format. But in France, he defended his French type of rationalism. So everything that I had read meant something slightly different in this different intellectual context. So that was interesting. The most fun bit was being in this seminar with Michel Calon and Bruno Latour in the CSI, the Centre Sociologie d'Innovation. There I learned lots, and also it was the only place where we would laugh. It was fun. It was really spirited. And I followed on Saturday mornings the courses of Michel Serres in the Salle de Vache in the Sorbonne. And that was also really inspiring. He did his own theater. He was really doing intellectual theater already at the time. But maybe what I learned most from was that I lived in the Cité Universitaire, which is this whole international setup in the south of the city, because suddenly my neighbors came from Côte d'Ivoire, from China, from Japan, and I learned a lot of stories from people from the rest of the world. And what I really appreciate is that this expansion to learning a bit about the rest of the world was not in terms of, let's say, not in terms of others being objects of anthropological research, but these were people I could talk with. They were subjects. They told me about their story. They told me how they looked at things. And I think that has helped me also a great deal, that from the start the rest of the world was something where there were peers who would have their story to tell. And I was also immediately impressed by the fact that I knew very little about the rest of the world. I thought it was fairly scandalous that I had 2 masters and I had no idea. While Hajime from Japan could tell me all about the history of Europe, and I knew where Japan was, but I had not learned anything about it. So I was fairly scandalous about the provincialism of my upbringing. That was what I had to tell for the first part. I would like to tell you about my mother. My mother was from 1924, and she had studied in university as one of the few women of her generation. She had studied geography, and in her geography there has also been courses in anthropology, and so she had learned about the world, and she did that as an escape from the small provincial town where she grew up. And then in 1957 she landed with my father in Limburg, in the south of the country. And for my father, this was great. He was a clinical neurophysiologist. He could set up new departments of clinical neurophysiology in 2 or 3 hospitals. So he worked a lot. But my mother was in the house with her 3 children. I was born in 58, I was number 3. At the time in the Netherlands, it was forbidden for women who were married to get jobs that were in any way paid by the state. And in practice, they couldn't get any jobs whatsoever. And this was partly a shift between a shift in class inequality to gender inequality, because an earlier higher middle class generation would have had domestic help, women working for them. But in my mother's generation, this was not on. It was really the idea that the mother had to take care of the children. So she was caught up with me, little, in the house. My brother and sister went to school. And I think this, for that whole generation of women, in different ways, that was a big tragedy. For some, it was a tragedy because they didn't have any education. Their father said, what does a girl need education for? In her case, she had the education, but then what she could do with is read books at home. Now, she remedied that to some extent later by by going in the school council and parents' council, and then she became a member of the municipality council, etc. And then by 1970, there was a shortage of teachers, so they asked her as a geography teacher, and she gruntingly explained, now there's a shortage, etc. and so on. But, she also became a member of an organization that was called Man-Vrouw Maatschappij, Man-Woman Society. And all this meant, for me, all kind of things about how we related, but it also meant that I was very aware of sexism by the time I was 10, 11. So for instance, if I tell my story now and not hers, in the last year of my Heilig Hart van Maria school, Holy Heart of Mary school, I said to the Catholic priest who gave us religion, I want to become a priest, what do I have to do? Well, I didn't want to become a priest at all. I just wanted him to say, you cannot because you're a girl. I wanted to expose the sexism. Or we had study days, and we were shown a film made in the 1950s. God made man and he made woman to serve him. And then you would see a kitchen where the woman was enclosed and the man was going to work. So we were allowed to comment, and I stood up and I said, we are in the 1960s, what kind of film is this? You're not educating us to stand in the kitchen, are you? So by the time this went on in secondary school, I was the feminist. So by the time I went to study, this was 76, I was quite surprised to see all these so many women who were just discovering that there was maybe an issue. And I also realized that having a feminist mother helps in this to see what is going on. And I became a member of, when I was studied philosophy, we had this vibrant feminism and philosophy group, and I tried in other ways to absorb stuff of women's studies that was just rising. I remember in the year I was in Paris that I was also quite surprised that women's studies wasn't strong there at all at the time. It was hardly pulled off. And when I came back in the Netherlands in 83, 84, there were no jobs. This was a slack in jobs. Also, the political climate had shifted very much to the right fairly suddenly. It was all scary and tragic, but anyway. With others, we organized a feminism and philosophy study day. By the way, I also did my first year of political science because I had realized I didn't know about the world and I wanted to learn more, so there were no jobs, so I better do something. And so I studied political science for a bit. And in this philosophy and feminism and philosophy day, I presented a talk, Wie weet wat een vrouw is? Who knows what a woman is? And that became also my first article. I spent months and months, because I had no job anyway, editing it and polishing it. And what the article does is really informed by what I had learned until that point. It it is a response to what was emerging in women's studies at the time, which was the sex-gender distinction. And the sex-gender distinction was imported from psychology. And in psychology, it had been invented to address the issue that people may have a different feeling about whether they are a man or a woman than what their genitals say. So there was then the genitals were the sex, and the how you sense yourself to be would be the gender. Now, in women's studies, this was mainly important to do social science with, or history with, and to say the social position of women is not explained by their bodies, which, don't forget, at the time was quite difficult to say, because there were these endless amounts of books explaining what the woman is and how she is defined by her womb, basically, or how her emotionality is big. So that was really an important fight to fight. But at the same time, I just came out of medicine. I thought, well, if you say society is not defined by the body, but society we need to talk about gender and have social explanations, the risk is that you leave the definition of what a body is to the biologists and the medics. And that deserves to be opened up. So that's what I put myself to do. And for instance, differentiating between anatomy and endocrinology, where anatomy defines what a woman is in spatial terms, with breasts and wombs, stories about that, while endocrinology talks about hormones and shifting levels of hormones. And these stories do not map, because you can have, in a person, you can be a woman in one way and not in the other, or vice versa. And also the kind of questions you ask and the materials you ask them with, and the whole practices of asserting what a person is, are different in one way or the other. They also come with different technical interventions. And my example was contraception. So in anatomical terms, you can have coitus, but you have either condoms or, I always forget this word in English, diaphragms, yeah, Dutch caps, it's also used. And then you prevent semen from entering the womb. While in endocrinological terms, women could have the pill, and then the egg is disturbed in its nestling. So these are different techniques. One is anatomical, one is endocrinological. So I set up this whole coexistence between the sciences that is practical, that's about the object, it's also about the intervention. At the same time, it's not just pluralism, because there are all kind of interferences between them. In endocrinology books, you see where the blood has been taken, for instance, or these both contraception techniques, they both interfere with coitus. They don't interfere with sexual practices that could be different. So anyway, that became my article, and it was published in a Dutch journal, a Tijdschrift voor Vrouwenstudies, the Journal for Women's Studies, and it was in Dutch. And I could never have published it in English because I didn't have the skills, and also it didn't have the professional science that you would have to have at the time for publishing in English. It had no references, it had no footnotes, it was a lecture. That was what it was. And that was typically also an advantage, that we had in Dutch these journals that were fairly low-key to get into, because the women in the editorial board of that journal thought, yeah, new story, that's interesting, opening up biology. So at the same time, that was glorious. I had my thing published. But of course, at the same time, it also meant being locked in. I'm coming to talk about that later. So in the course of the 80s, I went on to publish women's studies, or actually feminist articles. I'll talk about it. So I wrote one about what that was called womb's pigmentation and pyramids. That was both about sex difference and about racist ways of making racial differentiations between bodies. And I explained this whole thing, that in the idea of the sciences as a pyramid, biology is down and the social is up, but that we should stop pushing biology down, but rather open biology up, because it can come with very different apprehensions of what a body is. that then also come with different social practices, and that this kind of differentiating is a more relevant strategy. I did also another one on images of mothers and the welfare state, which in Dutch is called the verzorgingsstaat, the caring stage, and how these models changed together over time and how they mimicked each other. Anyway, so I did a lot of that stuff, and my idea was all the time not to study women, but to interfere with the categories and to open up the categories. And in that sense, not to do women's studies, but to do feminist research. And actually, the driving force it's a subcurrent in all of my work, that is what I'm trying to do, both to shift categories. So what I've been trying to do is not add knowledge. It's not this idea of adding knowledge about anything much, like there is not enough knowledge about women, let's add knowledge, or about anything else for that matter. But all the time, so I started that from then on, all the time to see how can we talk about this on other terms, in other ways, in other modalities. And this will come up in the rest of the stories I will be hoping to tell you. It's about shifting the grounds on which we know. That's what I've been trying to do.